All right. Well, hello there. Welcome to our Deadly Analysis Midsummer Festival. We have a fun night planned. By the end of tonight's podcast, we will have enjoyed such festivities as Skin the Gym, one of my favorite games of all time. We basically start with Jim's leg. We work our way up. Just going to stop there. Don't want to go any further than that. Kind of jumping ahead of myself. We're also going to be playing a game called Into the Void, where my co-host Ben and I proceed up a steep hill. We thrust ourselves off, and basically whoever gets the most hang time, essentially, by the time they hit the rocks, is going to be crowned Keeper of the Abyss. I really look forward to that. That's going to be the game to watch out for. Lastly, our co-host Shayra is going to host yet another orgy, in which the goal is basically to have all of the ecstasy-induced moaning like sync up into one singular moan. You know what I mean? Like Shayra's essentially going to be a conductor of sorts, producing pleasure music, if you will, to accompany the backdrop of tonight's podcast. So look forward to that. And we also have another Ben here tonight. We don't have any games for him. He's already played his game. Ben, I don't know if you know this, but everything you've eaten today has a little bit of each of our pubic hair in it. So enjoy that. So we are here to discuss Ari Aster's 2019 horror film, Midsommar, which is his follow-up to what I think is the best film of 2018, which was Hereditary. I've pretty much never been the same after Hereditary. And so I had huge expectations for Midsommar. And in my opinion, it did not disappoint. So Midsommar follows the story of Danny, played by Florence Pugh, and Christian, played by Jack Rayner, who are a young American couple with a relationship on the brink of falling apart. But after a family tragedy keeps them together, a grieving Danny invites herself to join Christian and his friends on a trip to a once-in-a-lifetime midsummer festival in a remote Swedish village. And what begins as a carefree summer holiday in a land of eternal sunlight takes a sinister turn when the insular villagers invite their guests to partake in festivities that render the pastoral paradise increasingly unnerving and viscerally disturbing. So here are my really quick initial thoughts on Midsommar. As always, this is a spoiler-filled analysis, so if you haven't seen the movie, watch at your own risk. This movie struck me as a kind of equal but opposite version of Hereditary. And what I mean by that is in Hereditary, Hereditary is a very dark and enclosed film, whereas Midsommar is very bright and open. Everything takes place in bright, wide open fields, not dimly lit dinner tables and tree houses. Yet at the same time, both of these movies prey on our deep psychological need for various sorts of relationships, right? So in Hereditary, Aster played with our intuitions about family and heritage. And I think in Midsommar, he plays with our intuitions about empathy and community, right? Needing to be comforted and heard. So both films, to a certain extent, traverse the relational. Both films start with characters who faced a tragedy. So in Hereditary, Annie loses her mother, and in Midsommar, Danny's faced with the murder-suicide of her sister and parents, and is looking to a person who is very unequipped to give her what she needs, namely her boyfriend, Christian. And this is a weakness that Aster will exploit as one of the central pieces of Midsommar. And both of these movies, I think, especially Midsommar, give us a character with a gap, right? Someone who's missing something, looking for something, trying to fill a post-tragedy void, right? And they're open to influence at that point. They're vulnerable. And in both films, that void is going to be filled with a kind of worst-case scenario. And that seems to me to be the horror and the MO of Aster's films. Find a weak spot in the human condition and exploit it as far as it can go. Tweak a very fundamental human longing and push it into some of the deepest expanses of the disturbing and the macabre. Midsommar is clearly a movie that's largely about codependency in many respects, and I'm sure we'll hop into many examples of how this is expressed in the movie later on. But the ending of the movie in particular, the very last shot in particular, actually is one of the most disturbing scenes of any horror film, maybe ever, to me. By the ending of this movie, Danny hasn't broken away from her codependency. She's doubled down on it, right? She's gone from one codependent relationship, namely being with her boyfriend Christian, to another, the Harga people. And the last shot of this movie in particular is Danny shifting from a look of horror almost to a full-on smile, in a single shot. And that's symbolic, I think, of the sort of tragedy going on in this movie. She effectively kills Christian at the end of the movie, right? Danny no longer needs Christian. She now has her communal empathy fix, right? She's now part of the Harga family. There's no need for Christian. And so I think the currency that's exchanged in this movie, the catalyst that pushes everything forward and undergirds a lot of the horror, is the idea of empathy, right? Like a kind of fellowship and identification that provides comfort to Danny during a horrific time in her life. And this is coded all throughout the movie, right? From scenes where the Harga people weep in unison, for like the swan diving old folks that kill themselves. The Harga people sing in tune all throughout the movie, from daily activities, just dancing around in the background. It's constant. And this, communal empathic connection gets taken to ridiculous and disturbing levels at times. Think of the sex scene, right? The infamous sex scene with Christian and one of the Harga girls, right? There's all these old women watching it and, moaning along with her and gyrating their hips all in unison. And I think at one point, I think the mom of the girl even gets in Christian's face as he's penetrating her daughter, and they're all moaning together, singing the same song at the same pace, right? So empathy is all over this movie. It's that sense of the communal, being a part of a group that hears me, that feels me, that weeps with me, that has sex with me, right? And that's what I think Danny will ultimately succumb to, because that's what Danny needs, right? They're going to give her what Christian doesn't. Christian can't keep the candle burning for Danny. Wink, wink. So I think, this concept of codependency is a very real world monster. It's not a doll that comes to life. It's not a ghost with a grudge. It's not a zombie that comes after your flesh. Like, this is inside stuff. This is self-horror, right? It's relational horror. This is a deep kind of horror that is meant to disturb you rather than to make you jump in your seat. And I really like that about Midsommar. It's a high-minded horror film in much the same way Hereditary was. And aside from that, this movie is gorgeous, right? Like the colors in this film, the blown out lighting, all of the little effects with the drugs that we see, like when they're eating at the dinner table. I think this is a movie that utilizes distortion very well. And I think that ultimately plays into the themes of the movie, right? Like things not being as they seem, having a skewed perspective, if you will. The Harga people themselves are somewhat representative of this in a way. There's this external veneer of being friendly and gracious, but under the surface, there's a duplicity, right? Their customs start to unravel. And as the movie goes on, the Harga people slowly begin to show themselves for what they are. And this is how codependent relationships work. Everything starts out fine. Skull, right? White dresses, dances around the maypole. Everything is sunshine. But eventually cracks begin to show, sort of what's bubbling beneath the surface, namely a propensity for a kind of unhealthy reliance on your partner for approval or a sense of identity. And so I think there's just metaphor all over this movie, and it's done masterfully in my opinion. And there's a lot more I want to say about the movie. There's things I didn't like. I'll get into. I want to talk about the acting, the score, but I'll leave it up to my co-host to jump in and discuss some of these things. I don't want to come off like a little May Queen over here, hogging all the glory. So what did you got? Like, I'll just throw it out there. What did you guys think of Midsommar? Feel free to jump in. Like those two old people at the beginning of the movie, just jump right in, pop in and tell me what you guys thought of Midsommar.
All right, so that's my old person dying. So I'm really intrigued by your idea of empathy, because when you, all of the things you're identifying as empathy, I identified as community. I identified as a sense of belonging to a group, and then what that group does to a person. So for me, the theme walking away from this movie was that hell is other people, but so also is heaven. That we desire to have a group of people around us, that we desire to have support of a larger social structure, and that larger social structure could be in the form of Christian, but I don't think that Danny ever expects Christian to be all of the people that she needs. It's only when she enters this commune that, and she she spends 2/3 of the movie resisting it. Like, she spends 2/3 of the movie thinking that these people are just as crazy as you and I think they are. Well, although we'll get into the ideas of their community
How
later.
dare you dishonor my family? I just want to say that. But go
Well,
ahead.
I mean, I think that we'll have to talk about, in order to talk about this movie, we're going to have to talk about the ethics of this community and whether or not those ethics stand any sort of ideological examination. I think we are going to have to figure out whether or not the ideology expressed by this community is one that is ethically justified. But as sort of an overall thing, I agree with everything you said, except I would, replace the word empathy with the word community. I think that this is more about how the larger metaphor of this film is more about how we place ourselves in a larger society rather than how we place ourselves in forms of individual empathy. Does that make sense? I'm drawing a very sort of thin distinction between empathy.
Yeah, there's going to be overlap, but I think ultimately I disagree that that's the major theme. I think it's at an individual level, and maybe we can argue why we have different perspectives on this scene by scene. So one of the reasons would be Pele, the guy that brings them all in. You'll see this all over the movie. There's a sense that there's a sense of I understand what you're going through. I understand what you're going through. Well, one-on-one, I get it. My parents died in a fire. Your parents died. I understand what you're going through. There's an individual level that sort of overlaps with the communal. But I think, I don't know, I think at the end of the day, the manipulative part that's going on in this movie is at an individual level, and what's being taken advantage of throughout this movie with Danny is, I think, on the level of empathy. I don't think that community is as robust an explanatory mechanism for what should be taken away by the end of it. But they're very similar too. So I'm curious what everyone else. I'm curious what everyone else thinks, because there's going to be some overlap there. So what do you guys think? Is it empathy, community? Is it both? Is one more prevalent than the other? What do you guys think?
Quite frankly, I agree with Noah that it's not going to be so much, I think, on a community level, or at least not the larger metaphor for me was something entirely different than that. But I also don't see this as being entirely manipulative either. Even if we were to take like that empathy standpoint, like I think empathy is definitely a key here. And then it is truly used to be able to show Danny how to move past her trauma. Because for me, the larger metaphor of the movie is about endings and about new beginnings. I think that's really kind of like the larger framework that we can understand the rest of this movie in, at least in my view. But I don't see that as being entirely manipulative. Now, yes, of course, we go into this community and we see very strange things happening that we don't fully understand, that maybe we can't fully appreciate. And I think we see ourselves reflected in Danny's character, again, for like you've said, Jim, through most of the movie. But in fact, I see evidence of that almost pretty much all the way up to the entire end. She always seems to resist. She always seems to be confused. She's not 100% sure if she wants to be doing what's going on. And I think we infer her absorption of that culture and her acceptance of that culture because of what she ultimately decides to do at the very end. But I don't think we should necessarily make that inference or that implication. I really don't see it quite so clear. Now, of course, other people might have different viewpoints on this, but yes, for me, of course, it is a very like singular, very individualistic interpretation here, where it's about this one person's endings, about her new beginnings, and about how this way of thinking about death in particular allows her to do that.
Okay, so when I watched this movie the first time, I watched it twice. All I could think of was No Rain. I don't know if you guys remember that music video where the little bumblebee girl is dancing and everybody's pointing and laughing at her, and she's all alone and nobody's like her. And then she goes through this gate and is a little bit weirded out by it, but then gets excited because she found her people and ends up dancing with them. Although this is way darker than No Rain. But what's interesting is if you listen to the lyrics of No Rain, it is definitely talking about how boring and mundane and lonely life can be. And this is a person who had a very dark side and ended in a very dark way. So it kind of fits for me. I feel like this was No Rain done with a lot of really cool paintings and traditions added in, and studying of runes and certain religious viewpoints and stuff like that. So it's definitely more than that. But I felt like I was watching No Rain, and weirdly enough, I laughed a lot during this movie. I found myself laughing almost every time the fool talked, right? And which was played by Will Poulter. I just found myself cracking up, and I kept thinking about conversations we've had together about how horror and comedy work very much in tandem, and how this is a film that really plays off of that. Like, it's kind of funny to see some of this ridiculous stuff happening, like when Will Poulter's like, I think that guy's still mad at me about the tree. It's like, he totally is. You're about to die. And I don't know why I found myself laughing a lot at it. But what's interesting, both times I saw it, there was a trailer that happened at the beginning of the movies for a film about an Asian girl going to visit her family that is from the East. And they're explaining to her, it's called like Farewell, or I can't remember what it's called. It has Aquafina in it, but they're talking about how people from the East, your family are your people. They are you. That's a very Eastern viewpoint, that communal and familial and group togetherness is very much an important aspect of who we are as people. And whereas in the West, it's very individualistic, you're all on your own. And you can actually see this played out a lot with how she tries to, oh, I don't want to burden my boyfriend. I don't want to burden my boyfriend. And when she was even freaked out about the old people jumping off the cliff, she goes off by herself to freak out by herself because she doesn't want to burden anybody. She's always worried about burdening people. But in other cultures, that's not how things work. And I almost wonder if this is only maybe disturbing to us because we're from the West, that maybe that's part of how our programming is, that we have to deal with all of our troubles on our own, that we shouldn't be burdening our friends with this or our family with this. I have to deal with this and handle my business. And that's not how this particular culture works. They will experience all emotions with you. Maybe the East isn't that intense with like the having sex together and stuff, but you know what I mean? Like this idea that if someone is hurting, then we hurt too. And we want to be there for you. So, the farewell. That's it.
That's interesting. So like, I don't want to say that's the manipulative part. It is in this movie. But I felt like that was the thing that was hijacked. That's what this community did to flip that switch in her brain to get her on board, was see that in her, that she was lacking that thing that this community could provide, and when, Ari Aster talks about this movie as being a breakup movie and very personal to him, a very personal movie. He said it was one of the most personal scripts he's ever written. That says to me, I don't want to get into the debate between what an artist makes and how we view it, because those can be different things. But I kind of went into it thinking that it was an individualistic movie just from that alone, that this is it's a breakup movie. It's a one-to-one. It's about losing something in a partner and gaining it in a very negative, unhealthy way somewhere else. So I think that was a big part of it for me too. But you're right. That definitely we're opening with a very like individual versus communal sort of approach, which I think is the right way to start this. Yeah. So what else do you guys think?
I feel like Danny's transformation in the course of the movie is more a matter of it's more quantitative than qualitative. The primary codependent mechanism that we've been talking about so far is between Danny and Christian. I don't think that's entirely true. I think we see a couple of times in the course of the movie, early in the movie, where Danny chooses the majority over Christian. Like the question of whether or not to take the mushrooms, she doesn't feel up for it, but there's social pressure being applied, and Christian actually sides with her. But in order to appease the majority, she persuades Christian to go along with the majority, along with her. I think she responds to the social expectation of the group. And in most settings, for most of her life, that group is Christian. We don't see her maintaining any relationship other than with Christian in her life up to this point. We have the family largely as an abstract, and that largely as a burden. So I feel like she was even more than a transformative mechanism of detaching from the individual and attaching to the collective. She's already on board with that. She's already there. She is already doing that, and can do that with pretty rapid facility, and then express the collective's will in such a way as to pull Christian into the fold. Empathy is a tricky word for me these days, hot off of reading an article regarding new insight in the neurophysiological mechanisms of empathy. And that, and I'll absolutely get you the link to this, that the physiological mechanisms, the neurological mechanisms that we have classically associated with empathy, mirror neurons, and some activity in the prefrontal cortex that we classically associated with identifying with that which is not me, that it actually functions in almost a hyper-tribalistic way. That when these mechanisms are engaged, it can subjectively translate into an experience of hyper-identification with those with whom I already identify. That I literally feel the pain of, I have a physical sensation of pain of someone who probably looks a lot like me. But that by virtue of overstimulation of other aspects of the brain that are trying to deal with this feedback, that results in a shutdown inability to abstract or apply theory of mind or a general intellectually held transsubjective rubrics. So that while this results in hyper-identification with, like, I can feel the razor burn of someone that I visually recognize as similar to me, a dramatically reduced ability to perceive the internal experience of someone who I don't perceive as very much like myself. So for that working, that take on empathy, this is absolutely about empathy. This is a horrifying portrait of the actual mechanisms of empathy, and the means by which they can be subverted, the means by which identity structure and the range of me, the boundaries, by which I define me, can be externally redrawn and externally redefined. This movie contained there are scenes in this movie, and we'll get into that later, that were, for me, I think at this point, 3 of the most violent images I've ever seen on film are from this movie. And they don't involve a drop of blood being spilled.
What are those images, if I can put you on the spot? Because, yeah, let's start there, and then I'll move on. The not orgy in the hut, the sex scene in the hut, is a profoundly violent image. And the moment that it became violent, and not just a violation of boundaries, was the moment when the girl who was being mated with Christian was no longer able to pleasantly engage with the experience, was no longer able to endure the experience. She is visibly in pain. She is visibly in discomfort. She is looking to the row of women that one would think are there for her support. They're not. They are not there for her. Exactly. Yes,
and that is
almost a rape scene.
Yes, yes, it is absolutely a rape scene. And the moment that it is unequivocally, unambiguously that is the moment when one of the women reaches in, curls it. No, it escalates into that, Shayra. Yeah, but the turning point for me was the finger under Christian's chin to redirect his gaze from this woman who is obviously in pain to a woman who is miming ecstasy for his benefit. And then it escalates all the way up into, as Shayra was alluding to, one of the elder women grabbing Christian's buttocks and pushing him on, which I would say is the point where we make it unambiguous that he is also being violated. So that was one. The other, and I think hands down, just to my experience, that one of the most violent images that I've ever seen on film was when Danny was, having seen all of this, runs away from the barn and starts screaming on the floor of the barracks, the bunkhouse. And we have her friend, her confidant, her guide through this community experience, at first mimicking, and then as Danny is escalating her reactions, the mimicry escalates until all of these girls are gathered around her, screaming in time, which from a superficial point of observation, it seems like an act of empathy. We are sharing your pain, but that's not what's happening. At least to me, and I spent most of this movie in somewhere between 3 and 7 on a panic attack scale, watching this. I was sweating. I did not feel good watching this movie. I can't. Honestly, have a hard time thinking of the last time that a movie did this to me. What's happening there? They are not empathizing, at least not in the way that we generally discuss empathy. By mimicking through this mimicry and this echoing, they are taking Danny's pain, Danny's suffering, and depriving the ownership of it. From depriving her the ownership of it. It no longer belongs to Danny. Danny's pain, and when we talk about philosophy of mind, when we talk about theory of identity, it's so well worn. It's almost a philosophy knock joke. Like we talk about knowledge, we talk about pain is one of the most fundamental examples. Like you can't feel that pain. You cannot know that pain. Well, in this case, they have taken Danny's knowledge of pain and negated it entirely by making it something that is owned collectively. At the same time, they have also taken her expression of pain, this very particular anguish, and through the mimicry and the chorus, it's no longer a sensible sound. This is no longer the sound of a woman in anguish. This is now noise. They have turned a particular expression of unendurable and unendurably particular experience, and they have rendered it into meaningless noise by virtue of their echoing and by virtue of their mimicking of the behavior when they themselves are not recipients of like experience.
Okay, so that's where I'm going to quibble with you. First of all, of course I respect your personal experience with the film and the fact that this film, made you uncomfortable. Like, I'm not going to try to negate that or quibble with that, on and on and on. But I think that that scene that you're talking about is the scene that cued me into the idea that this film was more about community than it is empathy. The sort of discussion I was having with Noah at the outset of the podcast, because I think that that scene, while it is disturbing on the face, I think that the idea of rendering one's pain into nonsense is one of the good things that friends can do when you're in pain. Like, how else do you expect? Like, if I came to you and I said, Ben, I have this terrible story and I'm in pain as a result of this terrible story, what do I expect you to do? Do I expect you to minimize it? Do I expect you to feel my pain as well? Or how do I want you to respond to that? And the idea that they could do both of those things, minimize it and seemingly feel my pain as well, seems to me to be the comfort that a community can offer. And the fact that all of this is so monstrous on its when we sort of take an objective look and walk out of the theater and think about the movie and go, oh shit, this is fucked up. That thing seems distant from the actual moment of having somebody scream with us. Does that make sense? And so it's that scene in particular that I like. You had one reaction to it, and then I had a sort of opposite reaction when I was identifying with the character in that moment.
But it's not a screaming with. It isn't a screaming with. It is the particularity of the mimicry that to me pushes it in the direction that I expressed. If you're screaming and I offer my own scream in support of yours, that's something. That is one thing. We Jim and Ben are screaming together. It's something else if I'm watching you and I'm imitating and I'm pulling and I'm imitating and I'm breathing at the same time, and it is a.
So you think it's all artificial? I think is what you're saying is you think it's all artificial that they're going through.
Absolutely. You don't get 10 people singing in chorus without practice.
That's where you and
that's artifice. It's absolutely artifice. We can see them studying her. We can see them getting a sense for the cadence and the pace. And I don't think this was I think this is, well, we see a similar behavior that applies earlier when the 72-year-olds are jumping off the cliff, that we have this collective scream, but we also have people looking at each other and taking cues from each other to make sure that they are performing in chorus, that they are doing this simultaneously, and that there is no individual voice in this.
So you see like a kind of Kim Jong-un thing going on here, where they are being told this is how you behave in this society, and if you don't behave, there will be consequences. This is how we are supposed to behave.
Well, I think absolutely that the people in this village believe that what they are doing is beneficial. I believe that I think that they believe that what I see as a total erasure of particularity of identity, and a profound violation of the boundaries that are necessary. I'd like to answer Jim, a question that you posed rhetorically. If you come to me with pain, the first thing that I do is validate it. The first thing that I do is say that yes, you are in pain, and what's more, that the experience you are describing is one where pain is an appropriate reaction. It's totally understandable that you're in pain. In fact, it would be unhealthy if you were not in pain. I would be concerned if you did not experience pain from that experience. So in so doing, there is an affirmation of, I am here, you are there, we are separate people. By virtue of the subject-object relationship by which I am commenting on your pain. And that's not present here. That's not present in this village. There is at no point do we have someone speaking to Danny, except Pele, and he's a whole other. Oh, he is a whole other kettle of fish that we'll head into, I am sure.
He really is. Yeah, I was gonna actually bring up Pella in a moment. Like, you were talking about the expression of pain as a community. You cited the scene in which Danny is obviously having a reaction to watching her boyfriend fuck somebody else, and that's certainly a scene I think we can have discussions about the artificial nature. The question of whether or not there's an artificial nature to the pain that those women are expressing as well. But when Christian is dying and the other two fellas are dying in the hut, in the yellow triangle house, they have a shot of Pella screaming, and I wondered whether or not he was joining in with the community's pain, or whether or not he himself was actually experiencing pain at the loss of his friend. And my understanding is that your reading of that shot would be that Pella's just indicating, to use an acting, the pain of the people around him, rather than actually feeling an individual pain about the death of his so-called friend, Christian, in that hut.
I would say that Hella is so acclimated to the modalities of his community and the ideals of his community, the internal and external expressions and normalizations that are expected of members of that community, that he is incapable of differentiating between the two.
See, I think that's a really good way to highlight what I found most interesting about your interpretation so far. And I think what I have the most trouble with is that, yes, of course, we're talking about some kind of like just like this fictional culture or whatever. And so before I launch into this huge defense of it, like I just want to go ahead and call that out, right? Like, we're not talking about a real group of people with real values, real mores, real norms. That being said, I still do think that this lens by which we're interpreting these actions and their kind of like shared experiences is incredibly not even just like Western centric, but American centric. Like it's really good, I think, to sort of call back to what Shara said closer to the beginning about, East versus West. And of course, I think that's really interesting here because of the collectivistic versus individualistic differences. And we've seen that throughout research. I mean, we were talking about psychology a little bit earlier, but throughout social psychology, there are measurable differences in many studies that talk about kind of like the impacts of Eastern collectivism versus Western individualism, and kind of like how that really does shape people to see things very differently and value very different things. So whenever we're talking about, certain things being artificial or fabricated or just sort of like to be manipulative or nefarious in some way, I wholly have to disagree with that. And I am glad at least that you did mention that they in particular, they don't see what they're doing as being nefarious and wrong and bad. Like, they actually think what they're doing is helping and good. Because that, I think, is probably the dominant thought in my mind compared to what you're saying in the interpretation of this culture as it exists as the setting for the larger story and the larger framework. I really don't think that they don't, if this were a real group of people, I don't think it is intended for them to seem like they're trying to just use somebody and manipulate them and steal their pain and invalidate them and beat them down psychologically. I think probably what this is supposed to display is perhaps an older way of thinking, a more collectivistic way of thinking, shared responsibility, shared experiences, and all of that sort of thing. Like, yeah, one example I do want to bring up is actually, if you go back far enough in history into Japanese culture, you have this idea of like honor suicide. Like, so if you do something that's so bad that it shames your family, you were expected to end your own life to restore that honor. Like, maybe if you're like a samurai or something like that, you see this. No?
Historically disproportionately practiced across class lines.
Can you elaborate on that?
A peasant is far more likely to be required to perform an honor suicide to expunge a wrong committed against their lord than the lord was expected to commit an honor suicide to expunge a crime performed against their shogun. You can and there's even contemporarily, even through the Meiji Restoration, even up through World War II. There was a very reliable dispersion pattern of honor suicides along socioeconomic lines. The poorer you are, the more likely you are to do it.
Well, let me see if I can make Ben's point with something that's in the film, and a point that's made within the film is we put our old people into nursing homes, and they have their old people jump off of cliffs. Now, I don't know how many of us have been in nursing homes, but they're monstrous places. Just like, I have been in several bad places in my life, but I don't think anything compares to the shit-smelling just parade of misery that is a nursing home at lunchtime. It's just an awful place. And when one of the characters brings up the idea, look, we put our old people in nursing homes and they have their old people jump off of cliffs. I'm sure that nursing homes are monstrous to them. That was a point that, as much as this community literally murdered 5 people, 5 innocent people who they had drawn into that community, as much as this community has a death toll, when they talked about nursing homes, I thought they maybe had a point. And I'm not in favor of old people jumping off of cliffs, but I'm definitely not in favor of nursing homes either. So I think when Ben is speaking to, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, but in a half-hearted defense of this community, in a half-hearted defense of this commune, which I acknowledge has a death toll, they got a little bit, they understand a thing that, from a Western point of view, they understand a thing in Western culture that is absolutely monstrous, and that is just the existence of nursing homes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely.
Yet we didn't hear that. We didn't hear that from a member of the community. We did not hear that from a member of the community. We heard that from an outsider presenting an outsider's apologia for the internal behavior of the community.
But that doesn't mean that defense is any less valid.
It absolutely means that it's less valid. That is someone from the outside. It does. Because that defense was presented by someone from the outside world trying to rationalize what they had just seen. We have no idea if the people in the community have developed this as this way of being as a response to a thing of which we don't know whether or not they're even aware of.
Sure,
we don't know.
It's not as a response. No, definitely not as a response. No. I think what the idea is, and it's not even supposed to be a defense of the culture. It's not a defense of the culture. What it's meant to be used as is a way to describe the fact that they are raised up and developing these mores and these sort of like traditions in a culture that is much more collectivistic than United States culture. And so to view what they're doing through a cultural lens that we would be used to would be a mistake, because I don't think that's not how it's supposed to be interpreted. They're not doing it as a response. It's not some kind of a nefarious thing in their eyes. Like, I mean, it's literally, I think, intended to be a totally different culture with a totally different set of values and mores, and they believe what they're doing is functional and good, and that's just how it's supposed to be interpreted. Like, I don't think that's the United States framework is just kind of, I think it introduces a pollutant into the interpretation of the art that shouldn't be there.
Can I slightly defend everybody here? So, fun fact, Ari was asked about this particular part of the film, and he said it was his twisted, dark sense of humor that decided to add in that it's their own faulty thinking that traps them in this environment in the first place. So a lot of times it's not even an attack on, you know, liberal viewpoints, but in a way it kind of is, this idea that we have to assimilate ourselves to other cultures, or, you know, try to blend in or try to accept everything that's different. It uses that faulty thinking to show how that could lead to bad things happening to you. It's his own dark sense of humor that added that to the film. But I love that people were like, yeah, I buy it. And this is actually a sign of a good film, right? So a really good film will have a villain or an antagonist that you are like, yeah, I get it. Like, everybody was down with Thanos. They were like, yeah, there's too many people. We probably should eliminate some of the population. And everybody was on Thanos' side. That's a sign of really good writing, really good characters. So the fact that this argument is even happening is so awesome. Like, that is exactly what it's supposed to be. And I'm not trying to downplay any side of this, but I think it's just a sign of good writing and good characters.
It's also a sign of a really good cult. Like a cult has allure. That's why it's a cult. I mean, you know, lest we remember, these are people who are inherently manipulative, and Pele befriended these people just to bring them in and kill them. So,
but he never lied.
I mean,
his first words of the film.
But did he, though?
Think of all the Swedish women you can impregnate. Like, that's his first words of the movie.
And where was he lying? He wasn't lying. One of you guys is going to impregnate someone we don't know.
But if you omit the fact that you're going to do the blood eagle torture on one of them, that's probably pertinent information that you need to add to.
This should be on the brochure. It should be on the brochure.
No doubt.
There's one line here to point out.
They are totally aware. Okay, even if we as outsiders are expected to practice good cultural universalism, and say that we cannot judge a system external to it in any way, shape, or form. And you'll notice that when I was listing most horrifying images, the suicide on the cliff ain't on the list. It's not on the list. I can contextualize that. Sure, the human sacrifice at the end, we can contextualize that. If this is a society that believes that it absolutely has a covenantal relationship with a specific deity that gives them a unique reincarnative covenant, like if you die outside the community, you're just dead. But if you die inside the community, then you get in on our reincarnation covenant. Then sure. You know, bringing people in and burning them alive, you're ultimately giving them a form of immortality that otherwise they wouldn't have access to. But this is a society that is totally aware of the flip side of that cultural relativistic argument. They know that what they are asking, no one's going to sign up for. They know that people external to the system are not going to be on board with it, which is why they deceive, which is why they manipulate. And regarding Pele, the film doesn't spell it out, but it certainly leaves open to interpretation the question of how far he went to set this up. Because this group of friends seems really odd to me. It seems really odd that we would just happen to wind up with a group of anthropology PhD students of varying degrees of actual demonstrable competence that would conform to the ritual major arcana of this religion, that we have the beast, that we have the fool. That seems like really long odds for luck of the draw. I think these people were picked. I think they were groomed. I think this entire series of events, as we saw played out in the film, is very, very carefully constructed behind the scenes. And before I say, was it murder-suicide? Was it actually murder-suicide?
Wait,
That-
what?
If I could
Danny,
really quickly,
arguing that? Wait a
before we
second.
transition, I want to clarify something very quickly. I don't think anyone in this podcast so far has used cultural relativism to argue in favor of the culture that we're talking about here.
Correct.
I think pointing that out is important because the reason that it was brought up was just to clarify that there is a lens through which it is more clear to view the interpretation of this culture and a lens through which there is some clouding and some impurity. The reason that this all seems strange to me is because I think all of you probably have seen the horror of this film being, look at this scary group of people and what they're doing. Look at this weird cult. And I really think that whole narrative is really just supposed to be the framework within which the main story happens. And focusing on this so much just seems, I don't know, like it seems like maybe we're looking at something that's sort of like beside the main narrative point a little bit. Like that was really kind of like my core message there, and trying to bring up, yes, there are differences. Yes, we can look in this lens or this lens, but ultimately I think looking through one lens will allow you to see a little bit more of the story than just these people are doing things that are nuts to me. You know what I mean?
I
Correct.
just want to I want to ask something, and we'll see where this takes us, okay? Because Silver Fox Ben brought up intentions and pushing this that these people were going to already be put in these situations. Something I noticed upon the second viewing a lot more was that the placement of beds where people were sleeping had art above them that depicted the exact thing that would happen to them. Now, was that Ari giving spoilers for us, or was that the tribe of people putting them where they're supposed to go to with these runes that, kind of are supposed to push a narrative? Why wouldn't the art push a narrative? Maybe they're trying to pressure people into these positions. Did they already have Danny in mind as the May Queen? Did they already have in mind that Simon was going to be in a chicken coop with his lungs out of his body?
That's very Hereditary. Come to think of it, Chair. I don't mean to, like, just really quickly, the same thing in Hereditary with the phrases put everywhere. The pagan, both have pagan things sprinkled in and out through the background. Interesting.
Yeah.
So was that Ari or was that the tribe?
No, I think that's the tribe. Like, I think that you have to consider everything in a diegetic framework. I think you have to consider everything associated with the placement of the beds associated with the tribe. Now, I think the images at the beginning and the images with the particular one of the images is divorced, or two of the images are divorced. The images at the beginning and the images associated with the woman chopping off her pubic hair, and then that being a love story kind of motif.
But only Connie and Simon saw that. The other people walked away from that, and only we saw it, and Connie and Simon. That's why they were like, is this a pube? And they did not see the connection. I think anthropology students would have seen the connection when, it was like, oh, this is a love story. Exactly. I think they would have figured it out.
I think that's Ari Aster, and then what the bed placement is the tribe. Let's sort of to frame this discussion, Ben. What's the Silver Fox, Ben? What is the third? You're embarrassed by that. What's the third image that was the most violent? And then maybe that'll help us frame even more of this discussion, because I do think that you led us to some of the things we need to talk about this film, and that is especially, and we address this not with as much depth as I want to, but a discussion of the community, a discussion of what the mores of this community are. But maybe your third example of the most violent act you've seen on film will lead us to another fruitful topic of discussion.
The series of events that follow the maypole.
So she wins the maypole dance thing, and then she gets ushered off by a group of people. Pelle kisses her in a length of time that is way more than Friends, maybe like a half second longer than Friends would, and on the lips, which Friends wouldn't. And then Christian is left standing there. That's the third most violent act you've seen on film.
It's that she is hallucinating. She is put through this ritual of physical exhaustion. When, by the by, paying attention to, and this is a whole, a whole other kit and caboodle, because the series of events that I'm describing is just to me profoundly violent. Includes the dinner table, and what we see on the dinner table. What we see on the dinner table. Oh Christ! And it will that deserves its own. Absolutely deserves its own topic. But she is calorie deprived throughout since arriving at the village. Constantly dosed with hallucinogens, and when my take on the maypole is that girls were told to fail. Okay, she was Danny, who has never done this before, did not, by virtue of serendipitous or supernatural intervention, find herself more physically competent at an activity than a group of women who have been doing this their entire lives. They were told to fail so that she would be the May Queen, which is profoundly manipulative in its own right. But then immediately after this, as she is expressing preference regarding what happens next, she is whisked away to perform this series of rituals, pulled out of a context of comfortability, support, and recognizable faces before, and again, she is still physically exhausted. It's not like they let her take a power nap after this. Put through this further experience of demand and ritual obligation before being brought back to a position of presumptive authority. She is the person who dictates the pace at which the feast happens, and we see her discomfort with this. That she is effectively officiating rituals of which she has no knowledge, and nobody has taken any time to give her any kind of guidance. I think and I describe it as violent because it is a powerful mechanism of. They put her in a position of extremely profound self-doubt and external affirmation. Any good that she feels in this moment is not internal. It is purely from the group. It is purely collective affirmation that's sustaining her at that point.
So this leads me to another question, and you kind of led this. You opened this rabbit hole when you said, "Was it really a murder-suicide?" And it seems to suggest that you think all of this was profoundly manipulative from the beginning. And that's something which I don't think is, well, okay, I'll let you defend that position before I say that I don't like it.
Can I say one thing? So it's obviously a discussion of intentions, right? So a really good place to have this discussion is with the elderly people jumping off the cliff. Technically, Pelle said at 72, that's the end. He kind of hinted at what's going to happen. Maybe that prepared her a little bit. Now, what happened with Connie and Simon, they see this event and they start screaming and freaking out, and they're very upset and they can't believe what they've seen. And there is a discussion that happens between two of the villagers where they are like, why didn't you prepare them? Why are they not warned? Now, is that discussion pretend and acting so that people think that this was something they were supposed to be prepared for? Or were they supposed to actually prepare them for it? And if so, how were they supposed to prepare them for it? What was supposed to occur there? And I think that's where intentionality can actually start to be understood, because it's technically Pele like talked to them a little bit. He talked to what's his name, Josh, I think that's what his name was.
Yeah,
Talked to him
Josh,
about
I call him Cheaty because he's on
yeah,
The Good Place. Yeah.
yeah, and I love The Good Place. But he talked to Josh and was like, hey, like, this is the event that's going to happen. And then we see Christian saying, what is this event? And tries to Google it and can't figure it out. And the black guy kind of smiles. It's like, hey, I don't know if he knows what's going to happen. I don't know that he knows what it is.
I know that he does know.
pretending?
He absolutely knows. No,
Okay,
he
yeah,
absolutely
so-
he absolutely knows, because earlier there's an exchange between him and Pele where Pele says, we are on our way to Swedish word, and he says, what, really? We're actually gonna see
We're
that?
gonna see it. Yeah,
He
they're in
knows
bed. They're in bed having that back and forth. Yep.
Okay, well
Yep,
then
he knows
then I guess
exactly
he
what's
did,
going to happen.
I guess he did warn some of them. He didn't tell Christian though, although he did say to them, yeah, at 72 done. Were they more prepared? Is that how subtle they're supposed to prepare people? I don't
Were
know.
they 72?
Well, I mean, we don't know that, but within the narrative framework of it, I think it's a fair assumption that they are 72. I think I guess what I would say is I wonder whether or not I wonder whether or not you are ascribing too much manipulative / omniscient qualities to this group of people than they necessarily deserve.
We are either dealing with omniscience. I don't think my explanation. I don't think my theory actually requires omniscience. I think that
setting up Danny's parents' death, and
That doesn't require omniscience.
yes,
yeah,
that doesn't require omniscience at all. That requires
A plane
all that
ticket.
Requires, yes, that requires a plane
you're
ticket.
On board with
And
this,
this is-
Noah?
Well,
don't-
yeah, I mean, so here's what I would say. The movie does not. The movie does a. It's difficult to argue against it, and I think that the movie does that on purpose. Like, there is no explicit answer to this, but the more you think about how the Harga people interact with visitors, you see this very, very overt and obvious sense of manipulation mixed with a very mechanical sense of how their emotions should be in various stages of trauma and grief. And this is reflected in Pele at the very beginning when they take the drugs and they're hallucinating, and you have that humorous moment with Will Poulter, and Pele says, look at the tree. Everything is as it should be. Everything works mechanically. Like there's this thing in which that's, I think, purposefully embedded into the movie to sort of show the Harga people for what they are.
I'm going to argue that you might be right, only in that if we look at how when he was talking to her on the couch about the death of her family and she starts to emotionally react, we see her go, I can't do this. She goes to the bathroom, she closes the door, and all of a sudden she's on an airplane. It's almost like what he did manipulated her to actually be there when the plan was that she wasn't supposed to be there. That's what Christian said. She's not supposed to be there.
She's just fine until he compassionately pushes those buttons.
Further, the person who, when they're all coming and they visit the Harga people, I think explicitly, I'll have to go back and look at this, but I think explicitly one of the elders looks directly at Danny and says, I'm so glad you came. Like they really wanted her there, guys. Like, so you gotta wonder. I'm a fan of this. I'm a fan of this making the frogs gay approach to this. There's something in the water. I like this.
Before Danny's family dies, she is popping Ativan like Tic Tacs, and this is 3 years into a relationship, Danny's own challenges are not invisible, and they are not invisible to Pele.
Sure, I can agree with all of that. Like, I just don't agree that this was manipulative from the beginning. Like, that's where I'm quibbling with you. And
All right,
maybe
all
that's
right.
a distinction
Jim
from
and
my-
Ben,
Maybe that's-
you guys would be dead the first 5 minutes. You're the sociologist in the story. I
No,
love you guys.
I would have been out a long, like, as soon as two people had their hands on each other's shoulders and were like giving each other uninterrupted eye contact for 5 minutes, I was like, okay, I'm out. This is not the place for me. I mean, I think
I
that's
was
an
done at
interesting
it's
question
9
as
o'clock.
well. Like,
It's
who
9
would
o'clock
have?
and it's blue. No, that's
At
where
what
I would have
point
been.
would you have left? What's the point that you
No,
would?
I'd be toast. I'd be toast. No two ways about it. I'd absolutely be toast. But I'm just gonna throw the even worse. A sociologist who has to die to avoid spoiling the movie. That's who I am, and I know that. I've accepted that. So
So you would be essentially Josh in this movie. You would be William Jackson Hart Cheedy.
oh no, I wouldn't. Well, I'll tell you one thing. I definitely wouldn't break into the temple to photograph the book explicitly after being told not to do so. I would find my own unique way to get brutally murdered.
The question is, are any men able to win anyway or survive? I think there's only one May Queen that's actually a thing. So you guys would all be dead just on account of the fact that you guys are.
That's what my wife
voters.
said.
Yeah.
That's what my wife said. The first thing Danielle said is she said, men are going I can see why men don't like this movie. That's the first thing she said. And I was like, what? And then I get it now.
Yeah, I mean, there was nothing in the movie, honestly, that explicitly said that all the men had to die. I mean, they ended up picking one woman because she seemed to be the most malleable to what was going on, probably because of the trauma she experienced, which I think is a stretch to say was set up beforehand. But, you know, I mean, I think the males and the other females that were invited to this commune were selected for various reasons. One of them was because they needed new breeding material so that they could avoid inbreeding, and they explicitly said that. And in fact, there was somebody else, not just one, who brought a group of people there. They both ended up being killed as well. But I think that's probably part of the selection process that we see there, is that, you know, you have to be able to kind of like fit in and sort of fall in line with certain mores and like certain pitfalls that you could potentially fall into. One of them ended up being used for genetic material and then eventually killed, and the other was selected probably to stay there also as genetic material, but more.
What if she would have chose
malleable.
that? What if she would have chose that the villager dies and Christian lives though? Is he permanently paralyzed? Was that a temporary sand blow? Like, what?
I thought about that
Who
too.
knows?
I was curious what would follow. Like what that would be. It'd almost be like
And
the
this
Harga
is
people
why-
failed if they did that. I don't know.
Are you
That's
sure?
why
Because like
I
they sacrificed a couple of their own guys anyway. Like they had two
Yeah.
guys that were volunteered as
they
tribute,
volunteered.
presumably because they thought it was some kind of a great honor to participate in this burning ritual. I mean, it's not like they only used outsiders for this stuff.
That's true.
Probably wanted to
But-
bring in some outsiders and use the assholes because they don't like them, right?
The difference is the outsiders did not choose and the insiders did. And that's where we have this gray area of weirdness that we're like, what are the intentions?
Yeah, I don't even think
What
it's
was
gray.
going
I think
on?
it's inherently vile and manipulative and bad. And I think that feeds into the larger commentary on codependency and how human emotions can be hijacked. So I mean, I
You could have easily
with
found some millennials that would have been down to be sacrificed for their village, though. Like, just be honest about what you're up to. Be like, hey, do you want to die in a wonderful village? We'll feed you really great and put flowers on your head, and then you get to die. It'll be great.
Yeah, have you've seen that? What is it? There's like that meme, the not Generation Z, but the millennial meme. That's like, what if your mom would have? It's a boomer saying, what if your mom would have aborted you? And the kid saying, I wish she would have. And the millennial's like, what the fuck? I don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to respond to this. Hey, did you guys catch the fact that there was a man named Christian going to study a pagan culture? That was interesting.
Yeah,
Just thought I'd throw that in there.
I did want to talk about that a little. So it's obviously intentional, right? This
I
is
think so.
obviously
I think
intentional.
everything is intentional with Ari Aster.
Yeah.
A Christian man going to I don't know, Christian.
And he's kind of like the main bad guy that they've labeled as the bad guy. In fact, when they are doing their little prayer spaghetti strings hanging over their face like ritual, they basically blame him for all the sins that have occurred, and like, okay, you're the sacrifice for all of our sins. Christian is the
Christian
sin.
is sacrifice. He's sacrificed. The Christian, the man named Christian is the sacrifice. I don't know. I'm just throwing these out there.
The man named Christian, who, I mean, from the very first time that we meet him in the film, we're not intended to like this guy. They do a pretty good job of laying him out as somebody who is toxic, self-absorbed, but not sufficiently confidently self-absorbed to disentangle himself from a codependent and toxic relationship, in which Dan is getting most of the brunt of receiving most of the damage by that mechanism. He betrays Josh by sniping his thesis.
He's a total
again. He's the beast.
We see his
the
dick.
Beast.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
Yes, we do see his dick. We do see his dick.
Literally and
metaphorically.
He is a dick, as in he is an asshole, as in he is a mean person.
Yeah, Ari Aster's like, this guy's such a dick. Let's just show his dick.
But they showed a lot of dick in this movie. Can I give a shout out to that? I know that this sounds weird to bring up, but a lot of movies are fine with showing tits, but they will not show dick. And I'm glad that we're getting more dick in movies. Like,
I think that we definitely need more dick in movies because it fetishizes it makes mysterious the male organ in a way that the female body is not as mysterious. I think we need more dick in movies because it is important. And I can't believe I'm fucking saying this, because it's important.
I'll second it.
Our larger culture that we don't fetishize this female body the same way we fetishize the male body. It's an imbalance in gender relations, and so
this did bring balance to the Force, though, because he was completely objectified. In fact, he was 100% used for his semen and for the ability to impregnate someone. He was 100% objectified. Now, do I think objectification of anybody is good? No. But to see that as a role reversal is definitely refreshing.
I'm not going to be happy till we get more William Dafoe penis. That's all I'm saying.
I'll
don't
take
actually-
as much
we
cock
don't
in
actually
horror
see it.
movies as I can get.
I think how we all like stop.
Yeah,
When
this
we
is
talk about
whenever we
Wolfman's
bring up
dick.
penis. How do you segue? The
No,
segues
no.
were working.
Yeah,
Okay.
What we did is we brought up
here's-
Willem Dafoe, and then we had to have a moment of silence for his dick.
Right, as always.
let us all contemplate for the next 5 seconds the sanctity of Willem Dafoe's cock. Excellent. Okay, so back to my totally psychotic conspiracy theory. Which is what are the odds that in this particular week, on this narratively convenient 90-year anniversary, there are a man and a woman, no more and no less, that are 72 years old in a community of about 100 adults?
I feel like you could calculate that.
Not great. Not great.
I don't know.
We see what, maybe 10 children of various ages in the community.
Right, but I
be
think,
really generous. 15 with an age distribution somewhere between 3 and 12. That's pretty broad spread for a pretty narrow population slice. So we're talking about it just based on what we're seeing. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5 kids per year. And that's not, by the way, reflected in the population, the age distribution that we see throughout the rest of the community. I think,
but let me grant you. First of all, I disagree with you, which fair enough. But second of all, if I grant you that narratively, if I say, okay, so these people were not 72. In fact, this was part of a larger manipulative scheme. What does that give you interpretively that I don't have if I think that those two people were 72? Like, what is it about that fact that you are able to that helps you understand the
there
movie
can be a
better?
both and. There absolutely can be a both and. Maybe the tradition is the tradition could very well be you're 72, and at 72, at the next one of these shindigs, you're going to kill yourself. What that suicide gave us is what it's PhD Daddy Ben was referring to as a selection criteria. It gives us a really, really dramatic event for the newcomers to react to in an either satisfactory way or a dissatisfactory way. I'd also point out regarding the planningness of all of this. It is really, really convenient that the girl that survives to the end is blonde. It is really, really convenient that the guy who got to reproduce is Caucasian with red tinged, strawberry hair. I mean, like, that these folks are not going to upset the genetic apple cart in terms of what the next generation of babies look like.
So speaking of odds, I want to circle back to the age distribution really quick. So I looked up census data, and it looks like for the age group between 70 and 74 years old, we see about 1.39% for men and 1.76 for women. So roughly between 1 and 2 people out of every 100 are about 72 years old.
Well, there you go. That's it. There's PhD Daddy bringing some
You
facts.
fucking nerds! I can't believe we're the only podcast on the internet that did that distribution.
They would look up God bless us. That's why you should like, share, and subscribe. No, I think for you, Ben, you are ascribing a great deal of manipulative qualities to this group. And I'm not terribly resistant to that, because I think whereas I see manipulative qualities at like a 7, you see manipulative qualities at like an 11 out of 10. And I don't necessarily, I think we're on the same spectrum. I think we're sort of quibbling about degree. And at that point, we can just kind of shake hands and say, well, this is a manipulative group of people.
Well, but maybe there's an interesting conversation to be had in asking the question, to what degree is the manipulation at an individual level consciously engaged in? And to what degree are we looking at social practices, traditions, and beliefs that have over time conformed to a range of utility based on practice, that this society has extremely manipulative practices and extremely manipulative beliefs because they work, and that this is just what their belief system has evolved into over a period of time.
I would like to point to the tapestry again, where we see a love story. Tell me what that love story is telling you. It is literally saying that you're going to bleed your period blood into a drink and cut your pubic hair into a meat pie so that you will zombify a dude till he falls in love with you and falls for. It's so obvious that manipulation is part of this tribe's views.
Wait.
And we could talk about degrees, but like that's. And she even put a rune of underneath this person's bed when she knew that there was a relationship between him and Danny. She put a rune so that he would fall under a love spell, and they were all like, "Oh,
yeah, she didn't ask. She didn't ask. Hey, would you like this rune?"
There's no consent there.
That's ancient Teutonic roofies right there.
I mean, we could talk degrees, but it's pretty obvious that they don't see things as necessarily that you need to consent. It's, oh, I just need to voodoo you into the hoodoo that I do.
How does that make them different than literally every other culture on the planet, though? Like, what culture doesn't have its weird magic rituals? What's fundamentally different about that and praying for a particular outcome? Let me go ahead and lay that bomb out there.
I don't pray, so I can't answer this.
Well, if I'm going to pray and say, please make this outcome the thing that happens, it's going to have impacts on other people, it's going to have impacts on me. You're literally trying to take a hold of the divine to lead to a particular result.
There is a fundamental difference. There is a fundamental difference, and
ingestion is that the fundamental difference?
It's what the neo-pagan kids would call the difference between invocation and evocation. Whether you are asking, whether you are submitting a miracle request to a deity who then has the auspice, and authority to determine whether or not that's a good idea, and whether or not you are taking matters into your own hands by directly interacting with the natural forces that govern human behavior.
Well, as the secular person, I'm going to say I'm going to group that all together because it's just, supernatural bullshit anyway. But
as the romantic,
well, there you go.
Wait. As the romantic, I'm going to say that ingesting a girl's pube isn't going to make me fall in love with her. Just as a thing.
Maybe you just haven't found the right pubic hair.
She got what she wanted. She had him ingest her blood. He drank out of that glass. He drank her period blood. He ate her pubic hair. And then he drank this hallucinogenic punch and fucked her, and she was like, I feel the baby in me. Haha. Like, I'm sorry, but she got exactly what she wanted with her little rune and her little magic spell.
I think to answer your question, Ben, I think the difference is that this is going to sound incredibly obvious. The level of directness between the blood roofie, we'll call it, and hope. And there's a direct action, I think, of physically going to a person and making them ingest something, putting something physically right where they sit. There is, I think even layers of consent that are still there when people pray for, I was a Christian, I prayed for a wife at some point when I was like 18 or 19. I was like, hey, give me a good wife. I don't want a psychopath. I kind of got something in between, so I'm really happy. But basically, like it's a hope, but it's not like you're not basically asking God, give it to me even if she doesn't want it, right? There's something almost intrinsically consensual when you ask for a mate or a spouse in the way that you're describing, right? And I think that's bullshit.
Guess so. I mean, it's not really about. Of course, you're not asking the person that would actually be involved, though. You're asking this supernatural, like.
But eventually eventually you are, right? That will be a part of it at some point, and it's lacking. It's lacking in this movie.
Not necessarily. I mean, ultimately, yes, Christian was drugged, but I kind of think that he could have eaten that tainted pie and still said no. You know what I mean? I mean, it's like still kind of like a request to the divine. You play out this ritual, you put these ingredients together, and like really though, I mean,
no, it's not. That's what it's back.
It's fundamentally different turns. If I can go ahead and finish my sentence really quick, is just to say that within every culture, you see some kind of a desire to manipulate outcomes in one's own favor. So I don't think it's inherently like unique or interesting about this particular culture in this movie that they have their own weird rituals to try and make certain outcomes happen that they want to happen.
No, I agree.
That's not the indictment.
Because otherwise, we have to ascribe power to laying a fucking stone underneath someone's bed. Like that's not.
But it's not. It's
as secular.
It's not what we think. It's not a question of what we think is valid. It's not the moral connotations of this action are not to be framed in what you think is possible or what I think is possible. It's to be framed in the question of what the person who did it thinks is possible, how they think consent works, how they think that human behavior can or cannot be coerced. And no, and this is where again, and I know I'm quibbling from way out there in the rarely discussed pagan theology, nitpicking. But there is a world of difference between, oh, Freya, send me a fuck buddy, versus I am going to carve a rune and place it under a bed, because the runes are not a prayer. Runes are not a request to the gods to intercede on your behalf. The gods themselves use runes to get shit done. That's how this mythology works. Assuming that this is inheriting in some way from the post-Etruscan Germanic tradition, which the use of the runes in the course of this movie would seem to suggest that is kind of the rough mythological ballpark that they're drawing from.
And
the phrase
you yourself just said that it's really about what the person believes is going to happen, is it not? I mean, like, the actual methodology is one thing, but you yourself said, you know, it's really depending on what this person actually thinks is going to happen, depending on whether or not they think it's a manipulative course of action and whether they're not trying to manipulate somebody. But I think the point
and what she's absolutely trying to do is manipulate.
Yeah, lots of different cultures have
absolutely
that,
trying
it doesn't make them like more manipulative. I don't think that's like an inherently interesting or unique thing about what they're doing. Like, every culture has their way.
If we were looking within the framework of if we are looking at a Teutonic, again, post-Etruscan, so runes are actually a thing, mythological framework, then the use of runes against a human being is really bad shit. Like the Burgundian cycle, the Icelandic chronicles. I mean, like, good people don't do this. This is it is an abrogation of the authority of the gods. It is an insult to the autonomy of the other person, and it is invariably, like Sigismund used runes purely for divination purposes, and it blew up in his face. Like, this is in Viking myth, the temptation to use a rune and succumbing to it is when the hero has crossed a line and bad shit's going to happen to them because they did it. So this is maybe in this community, in this subset of that cultural heritage. Maybe they have a different interpretation, but there is absolutely a hierarchy of what is permissible to be done to members of the community versus what is permissible to be done to outsiders, and the application of rune magic to supersede the will of the individuals seems to be one of the ways in which we can do that to them, but we don't do that to us.
We don't have to believe in it. Wait. I just want to speak out as a person who's like greatly studied rune stuff with my friends that know about this stuff before this particular show. I do want to back what Ben's saying. The use of runes is not to be taken lightly. This has a lot to do with that idea of when you put out like black magic, it's going to come back to you threefold. This is not something you do lightly. Although this culture seems to use runes even just for dreaming about things that they hope for, which I don't know if you guys remember, but the kids were carving runes with their teachers to dream of things that will happen to them. And there are runes everywhere. It's on the maypole. It's on the paintings on the walls. It's on their clothing. It's knitted on their shoes. And the thing is I looked up a lot of what these runes meant, and they are literally saying what's going to happen. Now, why would they stitch into her shoes the rune that talks about her completing this cycle if they did not intend for her to complete this cycle in the first place? They gave her clothing that it says that this is what she's going to do. And you actually see this on the drawing that Pele does of her, where he puts the backwards R and the hourglass shape, talking about how this is what she is intended to do from the get-go with the flowers around her hair. He knows exactly where she's heading. He knows exactly what she's going to end up doing. And he knows exactly what he's supposed to do, because his runes portray him as the gift giver, and his gifts are literally gathering up people to be used as sacrifices in this particular event. So and this is why I think he actually is crying. I don't necessarily know that he's crying because he fears like, oh, they're going through their thing. His crying is very different than the others, where they're like smiling and like ha 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 ha, and he's legit crying. Why? His gifts mattered and he got crowned. and he escaped this horrible fiery death that his parents had happen to him, which he talked about with her. I lost my parents too. He discussed this with Danny when he was trying to connect with her because he wanted to avoid that. He made sure that he found the perfect people to be put in this ritual. He made sure that he did his studying of them and their personality types and who they will, like how they will fall into place. And he even planted the seeds of doubt in Danny as they went along, saying, "Oh, he forgot your birthday? Oh, here's a picture for your birthday. Oh, he forgot it. Oh." He's planting the seeds of doubt from the get-go so that by the time it gets to the point where he's fucking this girl, she's not going to have any of it. And she's going to be like, you know what? I knew this from the get-go. Nope, nope, nope. Although she even had a friend on the phone in the beginning. I don't think she was completely alone. She had a friend on the phone in the beginning that was like, hey, maybe this is not your tribe, essentially. Yeah, it probably wasn't her tribe. I think she was meant to be a part of this tribe. I don't know.
If that's true, if everything you're saying is true, if everything Silver Fox Ben is saying is true, then having this movie take place all in the open in the sunlight is kind of a bad joke. Do you know what I mean? It's everything is in the open.
Yes. The whole plot, oh my God, there's so much. There's so much. The entire plot is spoiled in the art that we interact with. Every major plot point is identified. Where Danny's going to end up is literally stitched onto her clothes. The inevitable march towards sacrifice is laid out in the layout of the table, where we have the Ansaz rune. Folks literally translate it as the folks literally translate that rune as a homeland. That's not quite the more closer would be the land for which you bleed. The land for which you bleed.
I don't know if you guys know about Nordic stuff, but but it's not bad. Like, sacrifice isn't bad, and blood isn't bad, and violence isn't bad. They don't see it as like negative. It's like, hooray, we bleed. Like, it's powerful, and you are contributing to a greater cause kind of a mentality. So this is where I kind of take Jim and Ben's side in some ways. Like, I think that they have good intentions because of how their culture has interpreted what blood and death and sacrifice means, but they have bad intentions in that they are manipulating these people into this forced sacrifice, which they probably would not choose to be a part of. Although they would argue they chose to do it because the runes helped choose the right people for it, I'm sure.
But you can think you have good intentions. Do you know what I mean? Like, they may think they have good intentions, but what they're doing is absolutely horrific. I
feel like we've got two axes of criticism there. And I thought Celine and I talked after getting out of the theater. We talked about this movie for a good 7 hours. We split 2 bottles of wine and ate nothing but fruit. We didn't have any mushrooms on hand. Otherwise, maybe wouldn't be inappropriate. But we did our best with what we had available. Okay, I just in sufficient degree that at this point in time, I can't honestly tell you which of the things that are coming out of my mouth were originally my idea or were originally hers. But two axes of criticism. Let's just take it as a given that these people, let's say not even that they actually believe what they say they believe. Let's pretend they're right. Okay? Let's pretend they're right, and that there is an absolute annihilation of the soul on death, and that they have that their village has an exclusive contract with a supernatural entity, a deity, that has the authority to, if it observes certain practices, bypass that and pump the soul into this reincarnative population maintaining cycle. And there we have, okay, at that point, they're everybody that they abduct into the that they abduct, coerce, or manipulate into coming into the village. They're actually doing them a favor, right? Like if you didn't get burned to death, stuffed inside a bear rug, then when you died, you would just be dead, and that would be it. But now you're going to get reborn as one of our kids, who will later get to reach a certain age and then seduce an outsider and bring them to be burned alive. We're giving you a slice of immortality. Okay. So at that point, the horror of the sacrifice is contextually absolved. The horror of the you're dead at 72 click splat is absolved. The question of the extreme methods of death that are occasionally practiced by this village, we'll just say that the fine print on that contract with this god was really specific, and maybe they should have before they signed it. But okay, there are still two big problems. And there is, first, their coercive engagement with people from the inside that we talked about a lot, because they know people aren't on board with this. They know people are, if they put this all in the pamphlet, no one's going to show up for the tour. So there is an awareness of maybe this as not wrong, but certainly this as potentially interpreted in moral frameworks other than their own. So there's some duplicity baked right in there. But what Shayra was just talking about, Shayra was getting into one of my favorite parts about this movie and about Pele and about his relentless manipulative presence throughout, and that his sacrifices were ultimately successful while his brothers ultimately were not. His brother did not bring suitable breeding stock in, whether that was because this village has an unspoken or overtly spoken, and Pele's brother just ignored, racial selection criteria, or whether because they failed they freaked out when people jumped off the cliff and tried to actually leave test. Either way, his brother's offerings were not acceptable for the breeding.
Which is very biblical in a lot of ways. We think of Cain and Abel, right? Who has the right sacrifices or the right gift to be burned for God.
And the brother who had the wrong sacrifices volunteered.
Volunteered. Probably
volunteered.
Yeah. And I
people
think
who are only listening, we have air quotes all over that.
Yes. It's so the very interesting part about all that is, so it might be racially a thing, but it also might be that Pele was the most manipulative of these people. And we see this in the manipulation about the thesis, right? The thesis argument is not something these friends ever would have had. The thesis argument came up because he saw a weakness in them and a competitiveness between them, and he knew what they were both trying to seek out. And this is what led Josh to go and take pictures of the book in the first place. He never would have gone down that path had he not felt competitive with Christian. Christian would have never gone down that path if he wouldn't have felt like this, oh yeah, I already talked to Pele and he said I could. That was Pele like manipulating these people from the get-go. And there's signs that he was really good at getting people in the positions that they needed to be in throughout. And in a way, that's like, I feel like he's going to end up with Danny too. Like, I think he was also had a crush on Danny.
Oh, totally.
And I think he wanted to be with her, and I think he's going to end up having her. I think she's going to become a part of this society, and they're going to become lovers, and they're probably going to have children that are put into this culture. And yeah.
So it sounds like it sounds like we all agree. Let me just bring together some of our threads here. It sounds like we all agree that the Hargit people are very manipulative. I think we disagree on how, like, the level of manipulation, the profundity involved in what follows from that, if they're beginning manipulative versus once they're there manipulative. So I think maybe there's some disagreements there, but we all agree they're manipulative people and that it plays a very, very important part in this movie, especially all of us agree with respect to Danny, which I think is key. Danny is what this movie is about. The last scene is Danny smiling. And Ben brought up 3 scenes in this movie into which there was no violence and they were still some of the most horrifying thing. That was the last scene for me. And consequently, Ari Aster apparently had a hard time with that last scene, specifically the music, because he wanted it to convey sort of conflicting emotions, almost like a catharsis, a positive catharsis during this extremely horrific event. And I think he nailed it. I think that ending just that's what sticks with me when I think of Midsommar. All of the other stuff, it's amazing. You know what? The scene that really we haven't talked about almost at all, I think I'm the only one who brought it up really quickly, was one of the most horrific forms of torture ever devised, and that's the blood eagle. That's not even where we're at in this movie. We're talking about other shit. That's how good this movie was, right? I think when this movie was pitched to Ari Aster too, it was a very Eli Roth sort of pitch, like foreigners go to this land in a very hostile-like way and they get butchered. And from my understanding, he hijacked this idea to make it more personal, more cerebral, more high-minded, and remove a lot of the violence for some of the stuff we've been talking about, which I think is, in many ways, more horrific. Like, this is a movie with the blood eagle torture, like the worst form of torture ever, really. And yet here we are talking about people.
Why do you think Simon got the worst torture?
Yeah, I that's really interesting. I don't know. I don't know.
Do you think it's because of his skin color, or do you think it is because he tried to run away first and was the most vehement against their culture?
Yeah, I don't think
that's a valid. I think that's a valid explanation for it. Yeah, that he was the one who was saying this is fucked the most. Although, of course, Connie was equal to him, if not right behind him, in saying this is fucked. I think.
But she might have been a possible May Queen. I don't know. We don't.
Yeah,
I don't think she was ever a possible May Queen.
You don't think she was?
I don't.
See, this is where the discussion.
I don't think she was.
Okay.
I don't think she was. We don't see a lot of black hair in this village.
So no, I'm gonna go back to. I mean, you were trying to sum up, and because I'm an asshole, I'm going to complicate it. I am. Yes, I think that this village is manipulative. I think that they weren't entirely straightforward with the supposed victims of their village about what they had in store for them. But I also I want to go back to Pella's first fucking line of the entire movie. The first words that come out of his mouth are, "Think of all the Swedish women you will impregnate." Like, he is deliberately, honestly telling Christian what he is going to do once he gets to Sweden. And for manipulation, I think there has to be some degree of deception. And
isn't there lying by omission though? Isn't that a form of manipulation?
There is, but I don't
think of all the Swedish women you're going to impregnate, and then we're going to stuff you into a bearskin and burn you alive. Like, that's it's a pertinent detail. It's a good, like, you gotta have that on your Tinder profile if that's what's gonna happen.
There might be people that are down, honestly.
Note to self. But I guess what I'm saying is that I agree that this group of people is manipulative. I just don't think that they are as deceptive as a lot of us have sort of claimed that they are, particularly Ben. And
And just for the viewers, if you liked Ben's interpretation, go watch our Pontypool analysis. We got some wacky interpretations with Honey the Cat up in that bitch. So
right, there we go. Subscribe, like, share.
Oh yeah, we went like, share, subscribe, and if you like to be really, really depressed, watch the Triangle episode.
Well, I love that episode, and I love Triangle, but we'll get to that. That's for another time. I think that basically what I'm saying is that I think that this village believes itself to be pure, believes itself to be right, and believes itself to be inviting outsiders and new blood into its group for ethically justifiable, within its own context, ethically justifiable reasons. And so it seems to me that the word manipulation connotes a different idea than one who believes his intentions to be true. And so that's where I'm differing with you slightly. I can see.
But what if it's part of the system?
So
oh, Jim, but like, what if it's part of that inherent system? The manipulation is part of those ethics. It's a part of the mechanics to manipulate.
That deceiving an outsider is a holy act. That but even if there is a doctrinal acceptance of that behavior, of the things that we describe as manipulation, and again, I think I illustrated one possible way that could be theologically justified, because if we manipulate these outsiders into our reincarnative cycle, at least they get reincarnation, right? So that's not all bad. But even if there's the gospel is written and there's the gospel is practiced. And I think we definitely are given some indications in this village, there is a gap between the two, like Pele and his brother, this is theoretically, I can't help but think of this I'm thinking of this in magician terms, right? Like there's a card trick, the opening pull of a card trick. You can either do that card trick in such a way that you are guaranteeing that the mark is going to pull the card that you want, a forced choice structured trick, versus a free choice structured trick. This feels like it feels like there are a lot of forced choices built into this particular trick.
Sure. I guess what I'm. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I shouldn't interrupt.
I'll just tie it up really quickly. So theoretically, the people who wind up in the hut, that's a free choice, right? You're volunteering for the good of the village. And yet the brother who failed is the one who's volunteering. The one who didn't is the one who's going to be banging the May Queen after the credits roll, right? Like that seems to be what we're set up to see. We also have the entire question, and we haven't even touched this, the entire question of this village's holy book, which is written by, which is a mash paint on from the inbred mystic that they have alive at the given time, and then the leaders, exactly. We don't get a lot of insight into this selection process. Interpret three colors that were put on a page, apparently by someone rubbing their face on it, based on the patterns that we see. Interpret that into 20 pages of really, really detailed text, and it feels like maybe that exegetical process could use a little bit of transparency.
It's like basing a religion on a Jackson Pollock painting. I get it. You're fair in your criticism. I guess what I'm.
It would be if we were in the habit of if carrying your metaphor forward, we abducted someone as a child and fed them nothing but mescaline for 30 years to turn them into Jackson Pollock,
and then interpreting that as scripture. I take your point. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think that a lot of this movie is a send-up of, and a satire, maybe satire is a little too strong of a word, but certainly a criticism of liberal cultural relativism, that the idea that these people are that their culture should be accepted on face value is something that the Chidi character argues. It's something that Christian sort of hijacks as his argument, and I think both of those arguments are proven to be false. But in our analysis, when we ascribe to the culture too much manipulative qualities, we are taking away from the satire of liberal cultural relativism. And I think I'll tell a very quick personal story of a sociologist friend of mine who was talking about cultural relativism and trying to understand other people's culture. And then he brought up the idea of female circumcision and saying, well, look, it's just their culture. And then his point was, no, it's not just their culture. We should reject that type of behavior, even as we try to understand other people's cultures. And I think that if we ascribe too much manipulative qualities to this group, we end up demonizing them and taking away from what I think Ari Aster's point is, a criticism of our own kind of sense of cultural relativism, our own kind of sense of thinking that just because another culture is different and that it's their culture, that it is devoid or immune from criticism. And in this sense, in this film, he's trying to hone down and nail down the idea that yes, we can criticize those cultures, even if they are different from our own.
Can I ask a question really quick about that? Does he say that in an interview, or was that actually a point that he made?
No, I'm looking at the art and interpreting. I mean,
Yeah.
he made the film,
Ari Aster
that's
actually
totally
did
fine.
discuss that he tried to use as a joke that the people are stuck there because they're being accepting, essentially.
Yeah. So you have the one character who I think is like the apologist the entire time. There's a set of characters who are somewhat disturbed, and then there are characters who are outright rejecting what they're seeing. What I think have trouble with there also is that I find it difficult to say that this is a criticism of liberal cultural relativism, because the people who were most critical still got killed, and they probably got tortured worse than anyone else in the film.
They were critical of this culture, though, and they weren't accepting that they were different.
Right. So I don't think that there's a really like a deeper satire here about cultural relativism, because you have a spectrum of characters, all of which got brutalized.
Yeah,
they did get murdered and probably worse from escaping, and that's exactly where this entire film gets interesting, right? So Ari likes to fuck with people. We know he's a bit of a troll with his movies. We know that he tries to get in our heads and really fuck with us. I had a similar reaction to it where I decided to talk for hours and hours and hours with family and friends. After we watched it, we sat around talking about this movie for hours. Like, what the hell? And there were many different viewpoints on it too, including a friend of mine who recently went through a breakup, and she saw it as fantastic. And she was like, yeah, this is how you get rid of toxic people. You have to find your tribe and your family who help you get out of bad situations. Where
I thought she meant burning them up. Gotcha.
No, not burning them up. No, and obviously that was seen as more of a metaphor. Sometimes these people that are in your life that obviously don't love you, don't want to be with you, are only staying with you because what if I later feel like I might want to be with them and then I feel regret, so I'm going to stay with them. That kind of mentality. Maybe I just need to get away from them and like be with friends and family and not be with this person anymore. And she finally got rid of that relationship. So that was a different.
That feels more like Joy Luck Club to me. That feels a little more Joy Luck Club than what we got here.
I mean, essentially what happens to her is she is constantly told by everybody in her life, this is a person that does not want to be with her. And she has these people who are also lying and manipulating. Can we point out the lying and manipulation that are being done by Christian and his friends throughout this to Danny? It's not just this, village that's being lying and manipulative to her. We see this whole scene with mirrors. Mirrors are the huge thing with these. There's 2 scenes with mirrors. There's the one where she's in her apartment having this conversation with him, like, hey, why wouldn't you tell me where you're going? And he's like, what? I'm just gonna leave. And she's like, no, please stay. Oh my God, I did not mean to disturb things. I want to talk about this. Like, why wouldn't you feel comfortable telling me you're leaving the country for a month? Like, who wouldn't do that to their partner? Like, that's really crazy. And that's fucking nuts. I swear to God, if someone I was with did that, I would be very pissed off, and it would be justifiably pissed off. So that was the first mirror scene. And then the second mirror scene is when we go into Christian's apartment, and he's like, hey guys, so I kind of invited Danny to the trip. So I told her that you guys invited her, just like play along. She's not actually going to go. And it's like just this constant manipulation. And I think Danny finally figures out that Christian is the most manipulative and the most lying of all of the people, more so than Pele, honestly, is when they're standing there talking about this book being missing. Hey, if you see the book, put it back. We won't be mad. Just, sneak it back over there. There's a conversation that's had where Christian is like, that guy's not my friend. That person doesn't represent me. He's not my friend. Stabs him in the back, and you actually see Danny go, oh my God, you are a lying, manipulative psycho. What the hell are you doing to us? Like, you're making us look really bad. And you could tell they were like, okay, yeah, he's definitely bear suit material. They're like, okay, yeah, he's garbage. It's these lying manipulations that are also done by them. Were they right in manipulating these manipulators into this sacrifice is the question. I mean, we didn't know enough about Simon and Connie, and obviously that was messed up. And we even hear from Poulter's character, the fool, that he saw Connie running through the forest before she gets murdered, right? Like, I don't know. I feel like, did they feel like these people were qualified because they were shitty people?
Can I just go ahead, Ben.
Okay, I was just going to say that I think there is definitely a degree to which they probably were qualified for their particular roles, because what we're really talking about here are cycles and archetypes, right? I mean, I think that really sort of gets to the core of the real point of this movie, is that we are talking about a natural cycle and things that you see repeating over time, over and over and over again. And so, yeah, I mean, you're probably looking for particular kinds of people to play particular kinds of roles in this ritual. And I do also want to say that it's really interesting that your friend who was going through a breakup particularly enjoyed this movie, because I think if we go back to what the director really said, I mean, obviously, yes, he said it's supposed to be a breakup movie, but he was actually going through a particularly rough breakup at the time that he decided to make this movie. And so what he needed there, and I think the reason he picked this particular kind of theme for this particular movie, was because it's really supposed to be about transformation, right? So it's a cycle, it's about transformation. There are common themes that happen over and over and over again, and there's supposed to be a way to sort of push this through and be able to make this go from good to